Welcome to the Software Process and Measurement Cast number 739. I'm Tom Quigley, your host. Today we revisit the topic of empathy as we mark the last show of year 16 of the podcast. As coaches and leaders, we're taught that being empathetic is critical. However, the blanket statement that we need to walk a mile in someone else's shoes is not all rainbows and kittens. We'll also have a visit from Jon M Quigley, who brings his Alpha and Omega of Product Development column to the podcast. Jon and I continue our conversation on flow and its importance to teams and leaders. Being agile. Empathy isn't always all it's cracked up to be. Empathy is defined as understanding what another person is experiencing from their frame of reference. In today's Reread Saturday, we talked about coaching up. Coaching up requires the coach to be empathetic to the manager or executive they're coaching. Empathy is more than mere understanding, requiring more of a cognitive connection between two people or a group. Empathy is a very valuable concept because it forms the basis for trust, enables communication, and possibly facilitates the development of altruism. However, poor practiced empathy can lead to problematic behaviors. The first is reinforcing boundaries and defining outsiders, which makes it hard for teams of teams to interact. Secondly, misapplied empathy when there is no basis of trust. The illusion of empathy can be perceived as manipulation. In order to understand what another person is experiencing, it's important to have a basis to understand the other person. Establishing that connection or rapport with another person requires recognizing a common point from which empathy can be built. Intergroup bias, a cognitive bias, motivates members of a group preferentially recognize and establish rapport with others of that group and to reject those outside the team. Empathy can exist within the team, but not outside the team. This can sometimes generate fundamental attribution errors. Others are branded with negative attributes, such as being lazy or mean, attributed to those outside the group. So that bias really reduces the ability to communicate and interact. Empathy often follows personal biases and can reinforce us versus them relationships. True empathy might be impossible. The ability to understand and share feelings with another is, at best, imperfect. In a recent discussion, one of my colleagues suggested that since we all had experienced emotional pain of one sort or another, we should be able to be empathetic to anyone else in pain. I understand the point they were making, but that point reinforces that all empathy is imperfect. Each person's experiences are different, as is their ability to communicate. The degree of imperfection is directly inverse to the amount of empathy between the people. For example, I do not think the emotional pain of watching the Cleveland Browns lose has enough equivalence to establish an empathetic link with a person fighting for their job or losing a loved one. There needs to be some equivalence in the experience or the belief that is being used to establish empathy and understanding. Empathy built on a mismatch can easily be construed as manipulation when discovered, even if that's not what the intent was, because empathy is always built on an imperfect base. Everyone in an empathetic relationship needs to continuously test the relationship by asking questions and truly listening to the answer. On Thanksgiving, I participate in a turkey trot. It's a short foot race for those of you who don't know, to celebrate the holiday. Also, to pre-work off some of the food that we're about to have. In the last time I ran, somewhere in the middle of the run, I became aware that I was running behind two young women that, at least on the surface, could have been sisters. However, their interaction indicated that they did not seem to know each other outside of the run. The two women had come together on the course through a bit of serendipity. They shared several common attributes. Similarity included being running, that of similar builds and ages, and wearing a college logo on their running shirts. As most runners will tell you, sometimes when people come together in the middle of a race, they talk to each other. In this case, one of the runners announced she was tiring. The other indicated she had had similar problems in other races and suggested relaxing her arms and core. The semi-quizzical look she got elicited further statement that she ran cross-country, thus proving her qualification to give advice. The good-natured conversation continued for a quarter of a mile before our little group drifted away from each other. Two runners in a turkey trot formed a brief bond based on a common experience and some common attribute. Whether there was perfect empathy in that situation is difficult to know. However, the level of risk and the amount of trust needed to provide a bit of advice and companionship was low. Therefore, the experience they shared was enough for one to show empathy to the other. Empathy is a crucial tool for a coach, leader, or team member to help ensure a team stays at peak performance, if it's used well. Too much empathy can lead to boundaries that affect interactions outside of the group or team, while empathy built on a false premise can be construed as manipulation. Everyone practicing empathy needs to continually evaluate the health of the relationship by observing, asking, and listening. Thoughts, comments, all welcome. Please feel free to reach out to us at spamcastinfo@gmail.com. We look forward to the conversation. Jon M Quigley, welcome back to the Software Process and Measurement Cast.
Hey, Tom. It's good to reconnect with you again after all this time.
Absolutely. And it's been, 3 minutes since the last recording?
Yeah, that's about right, yeah.
Again, peel back the covers, right? We record a bunch of these and then edit them, run them for a while, then we record a bunch of these. And it's funny how the topics all stay in the same general part of the world, but the focus changes based on context. It's sort of like a different flow is going on.
Context seems to have some influence, maybe even matters.
So let's continue our conversation that we're having on flow. And maybe this will be across a number of different recording sessions. But last time we defined flow, right, as the progress of something between 2 points. And if that's true at a macro level, how would you define, what are the attributes of flow that you would look at that sort of level? I mean, if we were looking at a river, let's say, and I think everybody uses the metaphor of a highway or a river to define flow. It's like no definition, but I'll give you a metaphor for it. And I don't quite understand that. I mean, you might talk about, the duration and the intensity and the volume and maybe even the number of events that happen in that river, waterfalls, floods, all those kinds of things. And maybe the magnitude of those events. Maybe those would be the things that define a river in terms of the attributes of flow. What attributes of flow do we want to think about when we're talking about product or software or both, perhaps?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've not heard the river before, but I think that's not good. Besides the reasons that you enumerated there, the rivers overflow the banks. So it's real easy for them to keep flowing in spite of the fact that it's more volume than originally, I guess, planned or allocated.
Yeah, I'm not sure that it's a good thing when they overflow the banks.
Probably not, but they can. And I don't know what the analog of that would be for flow at a macro level.
Well, I know what at a flow at a macro level, what the analogy, if let's say we put a dam on that river, right? Stuff would back up on it, right? You would end up with a big reservoir of extra water if it's a river of water. If it was a river of lava, it would be a different reservoir of stuff. I don't think that would work, by the way. Otherwise, people would do it already.
Yeah. What are the attributes at the end, right? What is the desired outcome? Because that's really what we're talking about here. We have a bunch of transformations. We have inputs passing through various transformations. We have something at the input that we believe is motivating and productive for our group to take on, and whatever that means. Bound by the output's expected to be bound by some constraint. If you're making a product for a customer, that they're probably not going to want to hear that, well, the end product's going to be somewhere between $20 and about $2.5 million for the individual piece. No, there's going to be some kind of constraints all along, right? At the output. Here's all the inputs that I know, and I want something that costs $20 at the end or less. So those constraints are going to start to dictate what the flow looks like too. Mm-hmm. Quality, for example, when you start putting quality actions and audits and all those sort of things in, you're adding something to the transformation process, or at least to the sampling process that tries to determine if the product is actually on track for meeting whatever the quality target. Interesting. So you kind of have to know up front, I think, I know, as much as you can. And then you have to be learning all along with what you're producing and sampling. Feedback from that. Is this actually going close to what the original expectations were? Do we know more about what that input expectations are, the end expectations are? Are there any other attributes we can grab to drive the performance of what we're doing to the expected product output or output of the stream?
If I were to translate that into other words, I'm hearing constraints as an attribute. I'm hearing pace as an attribute.
Specific quality targets, whatever that might mean.
Is that not a constraint?
It could be, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. I that's right. It would fit in. It's the same with cost, right? Cost to manufacture, cost to buy. Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are constraints also.
It's an interesting scenario because, again, as we discussed last time, I find that people tend not to define flow, but to immediately jump into how we're going to measure it. So, I mean, as I said, when I started down this path of thinking about flow the other day, I started referencing books. And by the way, if you are an author listening to this and creating books for people to use in our industry, if you do not put an index in that book, I am going to find you.
I understand where you're coming from. We jump to, we can diverge just a slight moment because that's what I do sometimes.
You do.
Yeah. The common lexicon. You write a word in a book, or maybe even a small phrase, maybe 2 words, and you believe everybody knows what that means. Now, in some of the simple words, that's going to be kind of true, or at least partially true, or maybe it doesn't matter because the word is so little, adds so little to the context overall. But for keywords, for some words, you definitely need to provide some kind of your definition of it. I was a manager of a department once, and I took my group off to be certified in a particular, is a testing group, so I'm just going to say. I took them off to get testified as a certified tester because cool. many of them had never worked in a test department like this before. And I didn't care if they got the certification. Many of them did. I think most of them, maybe even all, but that wasn't my point. I wanted a baseline from which we could build. I wanted a common mental model of how a version of testing. I wanted a common set of definitions from which we can build on what these words mean. I came to understand this, how important this is when I worked as a project manager someplace, and the supplier's project manager kept using the word critical path. Now, in project management, there's a very specific definition of
Absolutely.
Critical path.
Yep.
And what this person was confusing or conflating was, I have a bottleneck. this thing's not moving because of something. It may have had nothing to do with the critical path, and most of the time it did not. It would not have been on the critical path. And so for me, in fact, that's the reason I wrote the first book with Kim Priest, because I'm like, I'm tired of hearing this. I think somebody needs to explain this a little bit to this discipline, to automotive project managers, because often they're not project managers. They kind of come up through the engineering ranks. But sure. I digress. The point of the lexicon, common lexicon, that's important when you're going through your flow. What are we going to call this? Do we all agree with this definition? Or when I say this, what do you think this means? And then we start to converge on a common set of languages and attributes from which we can make decisions on what we need to do with regards.
We can at least create a Rosetta Stone sometimes, because not everybody's going to have the same set of words unfortunately, for the same concept, especially in a world where there are lots of different frameworks, all pretty much defining the same darn thing, right? And every one of them has been monetized, so therefore they have to have different, both monetized and weaponized, so that they have different words for the same thing. Right. What was it? I was in the middle of teaching Kanban the other day, and in some of the areas of Kanban, some of the major frameworks, in Scrum, things that we call things events, the number of times that you have it in the time in between, that's called the cadence. And of course that makes sense, right? It's the drum beat and all that good stuff that we would think of in terms of the goal and all that stuff. In Kanban, they call basically the events cadence. Now, they are happening on, pretty much a periodic basis, but they've combined the term, right? Duration between events, cadence, and frequency, cadence, with the event itself. So it's like, well, I need something, my simple mind, right? I need something to find some mechanism to translate in between those two things.
If I don't think it matters so much which one, as long as, and I prefer to have them delineated, because they're two different things and they're affected by two different things, by different stuff, right? So I would prefer to have them delineated, but it doesn't really matter, just so as long as we're all using whatever that understanding is. Right. So if you say to me, cadence, I know it brings up an image in my head, and it's the same image in your head. Right.
It's back to that whole mental model thing.
Yes. If you want to take that, if you want to call it something else outside of our office, outside of this work context, I don't care. After hours at a bar, you want to use it different, I don't care. But in this context, it's not helpful for me to have the illusion I know what's going on, or you to have the delusion that I know what's going on when it's not happening.
I think we've talked about that a number of times, how it's where, there is a need to make sure people actually get assumptions and their understanding of what was said in a place where you can validate whether or not that's true.
Yeah, and it's not because somebody's calling you, you're thinking they're a liar. It's because we all think we see things, and we come to some conclusions about what we saw or what we know, and that's not necessarally true.
Well, it is what we know.
It's what we believe, but it's what we know might.
There you go. And there is sometimes a difference between the two. John, if somebody wanted to continue this conversation, how would they go about doing that?
They would connect with me on LinkedIn, Jon M Quigley on LinkedIn. They can call me or email me at jon.quigley@valuetransform.com.
And we'll have that in the show notes. So, John, until we wrestle some more with flow, maybe next time we'll talk about how we would perhaps measure flow. But that we'll do on another day. So, John, Thank you again for spending time with the Software Process and Measurement Cast listeners.
Tom, I'm always grateful to be here. I have a lot of fun chatting with you, and I hope I know your listeners get a lot out of it. I'm hopeful that I actually give them a little something interesting as well.
I'm sure they do. Otherwise, they would tell me not to have that Jon guy back on.
Get that noob off the air.
Yeah, no, I don't think so. In Reread Saturday News, this week, Chapter 11 of Badass Agile Coaching, the journey from beginner to mastery and beyond. Link in the show notes. Buy a copy and read along, by the way. Even if you focus your Agile coaching practice on teams, you need to coach up the managerial and executive hierarchy of the team. We'd love to hear how you coach up. In the next software process and measurement cast, using flow metrics to plan in Kanban and Scrum environments. We're really going to do this time. Flow metrics are thought of as incredible metrics for value streams and value chains. They're equally useful at the team level, and in some cases, more powerful. We'll also have a visit from Jeremy Barrio, who brings his QA Corner column to the podcast. If process improvement is a never-ending journey, why do so many people ask, are we there yet?